There are moments and there are men that galvanize a nation and change history. The weeks following the attack on Pearl Harbor were met with disaster for the United States in the Pacific theater of World War II. Each of the 80 men who flew with Doolittle knew that this was likely a suicide mission.
You already know this story. 16 American bombers, launched off a carrier deck in April 1942, hit Tokyo in a raid nobody thought was possible. Doolittle's Raid, Medal of Honor. One of the most celebrated moments in American military history. Here's what you don't know. What happened next? 3,000 miles away, to people whose names never made it into a single American textbook. Somewhere in a Chinese province you've probably never heard of, there's a museum built entirely around what this raid triggered. Not the raid itself, the aftermath. Stick with us, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why that museum exists, and why almost nobody outside China ever visits it. This is the story America remembers half of. Welcome to the first file in a series about the other half, the consequences nobody puts in the highlight reel. This is Ghost Files. Quickly, because you know the shape of this part. 5 months after Pearl Harbor, America needed a win badly. Morale at home was fragile, the Pacific War was going badly, and military planners wanted something, anything, that proved Japan wasn't untouchable. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25 bombers off the USS Hornet, the first time bombers that size had ever launched from a carrier deck, a feat many in the Navy privately doubted was even possible, and struck Tokyo and several other Japanese cities directly. The physical damage was minor. The psychological damage was enormous. Japan had believed its home islands were untouchable, insulated by distance and naval strength from any direct attack. In one afternoon, that belief was gone, and American morale, gutted 5 months earlier at Pearl Harbor, came roaring back. Historians would later credit the raid with helping push Japanese naval command toward the decision to attack Midway, a battle that turned into one of the most decisive defeats in Japanese naval history. But here's the detail that matters for everything that comes next. The B-25s didn't have enough fuel to make it back to a carrier. The plan always required them to fly onto China, land at friendly airfields, and disappear into a country that was already fighting Japan on the ground years before America formally entered the war. Almost none of them made it to those airfields. Bad weather, fuel running low faster than planned, and navigational uncertainty over unfamiliar terrain forced most crews to crash land or bail out across the Chinese provinces of Zhejiang and Jiangxi instead, putting 64 American airmen down in occupied and contested Chinese territory with no plan for what happened next and no way to know whether they'd land among friends or enemies. What happened next is the part of the story that almost never gets told alongside the raid itself. Chinese villagers, soldiers, and local officials across Zhejiang and Jiangxi took in the American airmen. They hid them from Japanese patrols, treated their injuries, guided them across hundreds of miles of contested territory toward safety, often at obvious and immediate risk to themselves. Most of the 64 Americans who came down in China made it out alive because ordinary people who owed them nothing chose to protect them anyway. Not everyone was so fortunate. 8 American airmen were captured by Japanese forces. 3 were executed after a show trial staged to look like legal process. That's the American cost, and it's real. But it's a fraction, a small fraction, of what came next for the country that had sheltered them. What came next didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen slowly. It had already been planned. Japan's Imperial General Headquarters had actually anticipated something like the Doolittle Raid before it even happened. 2 days earlier, planners had already drawn up a campaign to deal with exactly this scenario. American aircraft using Chinese coastal airfields as a base to strike the home islands. Once the raid confirmed their fear, the response was immediate and disproportionate to anything the raid itself had caused. In mid-May 1942, roughly a month after Doolittle's bombers hit Tokyo, Japan launched what's now known as the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. 40 infantry battalions and up to 16 artillery battalions of the Imperial Japanese Army sent into the exact provinces where Chinese civilians had sheltered American airmen. This was not a small punitive raid. It was a sustained multi-month ground offensive involving tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers, moving methodically across the region rather than striking a single target and withdrawing. The stated military objective was straightforward: destroy the airfields, tear up the runways across a stretch of coastline spanning tens of thousands of square miles, and deny China's coast as a future launch point for anything resembling the raid that had just humiliated them. The stated secondary objective was the one that turned this into something far darker: find and punish anyone connected to helping the Americans escape, with the entire regional population treated as a pool of potential suspects rather than a civilian population to be spared. Here's where the story stops being about airfields. Brace yourself for this part. We have to be careful, honest, and direct here, because this is the actual center of the story. Japanese forces didn't treat this as a search and destroy mission against military targets. They treated entire villages as collectively guilty. Units swept through towns across Zhejiang and Jiangxi, operating on a presumption that any community in the region might have sheltered an American airman, and acted accordingly, burning towns, destroying crops and livestock, and killing residents indiscriminately, regardless of any actual connection to the airmen's rescue. Chiang Kai-shek's government, cabling Washington directly during the campaign, described what was happening in stark terms. Japanese troops, they reported, were killing every man, woman, and child in the affected areas. Historians have since compared the brutality of this campaign directly to the rape of Nanjing 5 years earlier, not as hyperbole, but as a genuine comparison in scale and character. And there's one more dimension to this campaign that has to be named plainly, because burying it would be its own kind of dishonesty. Multiple historical accounts, corroborated by a dedicated museum now standing in the city of Kuzhou, document that Japanese forces deployed biological weapons, disease agents deliberately released into the environment, as part of this campaign. This wasn't isolated to Zhejiang-Jiangxi. It connects to a broader documented pattern of Japanese biological warfare research and deployment during this period of the war. We're not going to dwell on the mechanics of it. What matters is that the campaign's cruelty wasn't limited to conventional violence. It extended into deliberately engineered public health catastrophe on top of everything else. Now the numbers. Let's actually nail them down. And we're going to do this the same way we always do, because a single clean figure here would be dishonest. The most widely cited estimate, 250,000. Reported at the time by Chiang Kai-shek's government. Repeated later by American General Claire Chennault, the figure that's followed this story through most historical accounts since. Other sources are more conservative. American military assessments from the period, closer to 10,000 civilians killed specifically during the direct search for the airmen, likely capturing only the earliest, most immediate phase of a campaign that ran for 3 months. Modern historians researching the region, including Zheng Weiyang, whose work focuses specifically on this campaign, continue to cite figures in the range of 250,000 when accounting for its full scope: combat deaths, executions, disease, and starvation combined. Here's what doesn't move, no matter which number you use. This was not a proportionate military response to a single bombing raid. Even the most conservative credible estimate describes tens of thousands of civilian deaths in direct retaliation for an act of kindness toward foreign soldiers who were, themselves, just trying to survive. Worth pausing on one more number for context, because it sharpens exactly how disproportionate this became. On the actual military side of the ledger, soldiers fighting soldiers, Chinese army records from the campaign list roughly 24,000 killed and similar numbers wounded or missing among uniformed troops, fighting to slow an offensive many times their size. Japanese army records for the same campaign list under 2,000 combat deaths across their forces involved, alongside several thousand more wounded or incapacitated by illness during the campaign. Sit with that gap for a second. Even by the most conservative civilian estimate, the number of Chinese civilians killed in reprisal dwarfed the actual military casualties on both sides combined, several times over. This was never really a battle in any meaningful sense. It was closer to a punishment dressed in the shape of one, a distinction that matters enormously for how this campaign should actually be remembered and largely hasn't been. Which raises the obvious question. If this really happened at this scale, why has almost nobody heard of it? Part of it is simple asymmetry. America had every reason to remember the Doolittle Raid loudly. A Medal of Honor, a promoted general, a genuine turning point in Pacific War morale. China, meanwhile, had far less institutional incentive to memorialize a catastrophe inflicted on its own people as a side effect of helping someone else's war effort. But there's a second, more uncomfortable layer specific to China itself. Later political shifts inside China meant this story sat uncomfortably for decades. A moment of ordinary people risking everything to help American soldiers wasn't always the story the state wanted told, especially as the political relationship between China and the West shifted dramatically in the years that followed the war. Multiple accounts describe entire generations of Chinese citizens in the affected regions growing up without ever learning the specifics of what their grandparents lived through or why, the story preserved mostly in local memory, family accounts, and a handful of dedicated regional historians working against decades of institutional silence rather than official commemoration. That's the double erasure at the heart of this story. One side had no reason to dwell on the cost, and the other side, for a long stretch, had active reasons not to. The result is a 250,000-person catastrophe that barely registers next to the 16 bombers that caused it. Two very different countries for two very different reasons, both arriving at the same outcome: silence. This is why we're opening Ghost Files with this story specifically, and not a more obviously dramatic one. Every episode in this series is going to work the same way. Take something you already think you understand and show you the half of it that got left out, not to diminish the original story, but because leaving out the cost is its own kind of dishonesty. The Doolittle Raid was genuinely important. It genuinely mattered to the war's outcome. None of that changes because 250,000 people paid for it in a province most people watching this can't find on a map. That's the pattern you're going to see across everything we cover from here forward, whether we're deep in a hidden arms deal, a forgotten act of courage, or the economics nobody accounts for. The visible story is rarely the whole story. Somebody has to go looking for the rest of it. 64 American airmen came down in China expecting to disappear into hostile territory. Instead, they were sheltered, fed, and guided to safety by people who owed them nothing. Weeks later, an estimated 250,000 of those same people were dead. That's not a footnote to the Doolittle Raid. It's the other half of it, and it's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. This is Ghost Files. Every episode, we're going to hand you a story you think you already know, and then show you the room nobody wanted you to see. If you want the rest of the ghosts still hiding inside the history in front of you, subscribe. We've only just opened the first file.